Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Follow to Lead podcast. I'm so excited today to have the legendary alumni from Wright State University, Dr. Curt Thompson.
Wow.
Curt, thank you so much for being back on the podcast.
Uh, Tony, it's great to be here. And I don't think my name has ever been in the same sentence with the word legendary and me having anything to do with that word. So it's an honor. I'm thrilled to be back and just really looking forward to having a good conversation today. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Well, one of the places that I like to start is this idea about calling. And, obviously you practice mental health, but you also write and you speak. And so I'm curious how you would define the calling that God has placed on your life.
Hmm. Tony, I have a friend, you may know him, and you may even know him, his work, Andy Crouch, who wrote an essay once about this question of calling. And he noted that we are primarily called, from a biblical standpoint, we're primarily called to bear and to restore the image of God. That's our calling. And everything else downstream of that, whether or not it lands into the specific realm of calling, and that one might wonder that. So one say, well, I'm called to be any number of things, but what happens if the thing that I'm doing, the economy dries up and that thing no longer exists? So what does that mean about my calling and so forth? But I think for me, one of the ways that Andy's words are really helpful is that I think we bear the image of God in multiple different domains, and we restore the image of God in multiple different domains of our lives. And that whole notion of where the things that really generate, passion for us and energy and eagerness and so forth and so on, along with, where is that helpful? Where can I, how can be compensated for that? There are a whole range of questions about calling, but all that to say is that for me, in the work that I do, I do say to people that in the work that I do, it's a culmination of Jesus coming to find me in multiple different times and places over the course of my life, beginning with my parents, and then with, going to church camp as a young kid, and then having a significant experience when I was 13. And then all the kind of, following moments of intersections with important people, all of which Jesus is like showing up in the room and saying, yeah, come do that. Pay attention to this. Come do this. And so this work that I'm doing now, I think, is a culmination of lots of these moments that have come together. And with me trying, imperfectly, but trying to listen to the Spirit saying, "Hey, let's do this. Let's do this." And there may be many things that the Spirit has probably said, "Hey, what if you think about this?" over the course of my life, and I wasn't listening, or I heard it and I'm too afraid to do it, and I don't have a bunch of wolves sitting around so like Gideon, I could just say, "Hey, could we do a little test experiment here? I'm going to put this out in the front yard and see what kind of dew level is on it in the next morning," and so forth. So, I mean, for me, I think it's a matter of paying attention to what my longings are and where is that intersecting with, what is possible in the course of my day-to-day life, and trying to pay attention to that and listening to that, not just in my own head, but also in light of the counsel of many, many people over the course of my life in the last 37 and a half years, not least that of my wife, who can speak wisdom into that. That's a long-winded answer to your question.
I love it. Look, we're here. The whole blessing behind the podcast is that it's long-winded. So it's a lot of people are leaning into all of that. And what I appreciate about it is you kind of went through even a framework just by talking through the process. Is this
Mm,
scripture, this kind of what I call the counsel of the godly, the godly men and women in your life,
mm, mm,
including especially
mm,
the one you're in
mm,
covenant with your wife. And
mhm,
um,
mm,
when you take
mm,
on a project like this latest book, The Deepest
mhm,
Place, this is obviously
mhm,
a long, it's an outpouring of your heart. It's a deep dive into a lot of different places. How
mm,
do you know that this is the right yes for what God is calling you to?
mm,
You talked about that longing. What's the
mm,
difference between
mm.
longing that is kind of pushed by God and just my desire to write another book?
Yeah, it's a good. Well, I think it is even in the nature of how we ask that question. Is it this or is it? How do we know that it's this or it's
Mm,
that? The notion of how I think we. I'll speak for myself. I think I have a tendency. It's easy for me to imagine the world in terms of binary questions that I
yeah.
ask, right? That either have an answer. It's A or it's B. Which is it? And I think the fact that I even ask my questions in that way is a way for me to protect against my fear that I'm going to be somehow not doing this the right way, which is really the wolf of shame at my
Mm,
door, waiting to do its work. And it's what we it you know it's what we tend to do in a lot of different moments in life. Is I want to know where the line is. I want to know, should I do this or should I do this? These kind of binary things. We encounter this with patients all the time, and especially in this work that we do in confessional communities that I talk about, in different places, um, where the question comes up. I don't know if it's okay for me to fill in the blank.
yeah.
And our natural question that comes is like, well, what's the worry? What's the worry? And typically, the worry that sits at the end of just about everybody's question around these kinds of things is should I do this or should I do that? Is if I do that which it turns out I should not have done or whatever, that living in a box alone under a bridge is waiting for me.
Mm,
That's what's. I am going to be left alone with my shame, sent out of the camp like Leviticus. I'm sent out of the camp because no one wants to. You don't want me around. Like this is, you know, it's
yeah.
hell. I'm like this is what I fear is waiting for me if I get this wrong. And so one of the things that we tell people when we're doing this work in these communities is, part of what we're doing here is that we are culling out, and curating wisdom because we want people to do that which is wise. But if you do something and it turns out like that's not a thing that you wanted to have done, we're not leaving the room. You'll come
Yeah.
back and we will work through whatever the thing is that you work through that you're still like, I wish I hadn't done that. This doesn't answer your question directly, but it gets at it. This notion of we face these kinds of moments dozens of times every day. There are just some times when the moment feels bigger than others. Typically, those big moments are really just collections of smaller moments. And when it comes to writing this book, I would say that again, it is a discernment process, mostly for me, that is a result of the culmination of a significant critical mass of evidence that presents itself, evidence of the topic that presents itself in such a way that is irresistibly compelling. And I'll never forget it. Like there was. I mean, the content of this book I had been kind of like reflecting on and meditating on for actually several years. But there was a moment in one of the groups where everything just
Yeah.
crystallized in a moment where one and I refer to this person, where there was a person in one of our groups that said, after 25 years, why I can't keep doing this? Why does this still
Mm.
happen? And this is the this basically is they're asking, why do I still struggle with me after literally 25 years of really fruitful, uh, deeply life-changing work? This person's life is nothing like it was when I first met them. They have done unbelievable work. And at the same time, they still continue to face real things in their life that continue to just pound them. And this would be, when Jesus writes in John's gospel, and as it turns out, in this world, you will have
Mm.
tribulation. Like that's what's going to happen. And this person, like what they articulated was, without saying this, there is a certain suffering that we're watching happen. In this case, precisely because they are running to the light.
Yeah.
And it was in that moment that I thought, gosh, all this stuff is kind of like, okay, it's now go. It's time to address that thing in that particular piece. And so, the very first book that I wrote, which is now 14 years ago this summer, it will have come out. It took me a long time. It took me, I have my good friend who's my literary agent, Leslie Nunn, Reed. She had for 10 years been saying to me, "Gosh, Curt, what are you thinking about?" We'd talk about things. I think there's a book there. And I'm like, "Yeah, but there's a 6 and a 3-year-old over there in my kitchen, and I don't really have time to write a book." And we would have these conversations for a long time. And then there was this moment where I was doing a lecture series in our church, and there was a former pastor there who I deeply respected, and he was there. And at the end of one of these sessions, he says to me, "You need to
Mm.
write this." And just like that, it's like, okay. Now, Leslie, later would say like, "Oh, I see how this works. I talked to you for 10 years and nothing. And you talked to Dennis
I,
and like in 3 minutes, like you say, well, we're going to
that's
write a
so
book."
good. I
I say, well, I mean,
did
like,
see that you dedicated the book to her, though.
yeah, this
Yeah.
one. Yeah. 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 So, I mean, I think again, it is a byproduct of, even this. There's a sense in which you have a nudge, you have a sense of this is a right and
Mm.
good thing to do, and you're looking around, you're saying, well, do I have time to do this? Is this the right timing for this? Does it, and so, it was not even within my imagination, 15 years ago or six, whenever it would be in the process of writing a book. This was not part of my
Sure.
landscape, that being a writer was not a thing. And even after the first book, even after the second book, you know, I don't know that being a writer is a way that I would think about myself. It's not a category that I still, I'm a psychiatrist who's written 2 books. I think I was more willing to consider that after the third book, because the third book was, the Soul Desire is the one I think I'm most pleased
Mm.
about personally, because of the work that took to kind of bring it into the world, and the nature of the work that is there. So I have a particular relationship with that book, and after that, I felt like, okay, I think I'm willing to entertain that is a way to describe what I do as a writer. And so, if you're in that space where you are willing to be called a writer, then that I'm actually looking for, and I'm considering in
Uh,
advance. Are there things that I need to be writing about? That wouldn't have been something I was considering at all 15 years ago. I wasn't a writer. That's not what I do. I'm a psychiatrist, so I see patients. Um, but now, there are other things. But in the same way, I think, there was a time when I wasn't a father, and then I became a father. And once you are a father, you start to look for things to be yourself and to be for your children that before you're a father you don't do.
hmm.
Um, it's true for a lot of things, I think.
I would be remiss if I didn't drill down on this idea about binary questions and the results of those things. I have a dear friend of mine who's
Yeah.
in one of my groups of men that I meet with regularly, very similar to your confessional. We
Hmm.
talk about the status of our soul kind of environments just for
Yeah.
spiritual development. And he is an engineer in the Air Force. He has three beautiful kids and a wife, and what he would tell you that his brain is hardwired that there is a right and wrong answer to everything. Now we nudge up against that because Scripture nudges up against that, and so I'm
Hmm.
curious for a guy like Matt, what's a muscle that we can flex? What's an exercise that we can do to help get out of this binary question kind of mode?
Well, see, even here, we're tempted to say, "Oh, yes, there is," or "No, there isn't" a binary way to think. To even that,
Yeah,
like
that's
you
meta.
see how
Yeah,
quickly we kind of get drawn into the whirlpool. Well, I mean, I think let me just say, I don't mean I don't mean it's important for us to recognize that I'm not saying that there are not proper ways to
of
do
course. Yeah.
things. Like, but we might say, okay, there is a way, and it's close to being the only way that one puts this new tire on to where the flat tire was. I don't just like have an infinite array of ways that I can put that on. Like it's made to be put on in a particular way. And I would say that. But I would also say that beyond that, there is something about wanting to be correct, wanting to be right, wanting to be good about how I put that tire on because I want my tire to work so my car will work so I can go to the airport to pick up my
Mm,
wife. And so this is the work of Ian McGilchrist and the Master and His Emissary and this whole notion of like how our right and our left hemispheres in many respects are really quite able to do the same thing. Like my right and my left brain when we come out of the uterus, like they're quite capable of eventually doing the same thing if we were to allow them. Over time, they kind of self congregate in such a way that, oh, now my left brain is doing these things and my right brain is doing these things. But one thing that is different about both of them, that remains different, has to do with the way they pay attention to the world.
mm,
It's not just the particular functions, but the posture that they have to the world. And the right hemisphere, which comes online, has a posture of withness. I want to be with you. I am engaged in the present moment. You're going, you go to a great concert or you go to see a stand-up comic that you've really been wanting, and for 90 minutes you are just held. You don't know what time it is. You don't know what night you're in. You don't know. You are just you, and your friends are just completely kind of putty in the hands of, and you are with. Uh, but when this is over, like you got to find your way
right.
home. And so, like, I can't just kind of be with you and not get me home. I got to know how I got to do that. And I can't just go randomly to anybody's house. There might be more than one way for me to get home, but like, it's not like I got multiple homes to go
Mm,
to. I just got one home. And so there is a way that I'm going to do this, but my left brain is continually working to do the work it needs to do, the right, the wrong, the binary way of thinking about this, in the service of the right. And the challenge, and so therefore, there are certain domains uh, of of the world in which we live. Like if I'm a pilot, I don't just. It's not like I'm just not here to be with you. No, like I got a checklist of things that I got to go through. I like, and because if I don't do if I don't do this the right way, like people lose their lives. Right, so it's like they're not messing around. And if you are someone, you're an engineer, you're a pilot, you are someone who 8 to 10 hours a day you are practicing behaviors. You're practicing a life that requires that kind of precision. That does not have has very little, if any, margin for there being a range of things we could do. We don't have a lot of margin for that. This becomes the way we practice being in the world.
Mm.
And it becomes the way that we then understand most of the world. And so when and so it's easy for us to imagine, now I'm having a conflict. I've done my work all day, and now I come home and we're at dinner, and then after my spouse presents me with something that's going on, and it's easy for me to just my posture toward this is going to be the same as it was the posture toward the algorithm I was trying to figure out at work
Wow.
today. This is a problem. We're going to solve this. Blah 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 blah. And I forget that my wife is not a
Mm.
computer, and she doesn't really give a whit about right or
Right.
wrong. She just simply wants to be seen and heard and understood. She doesn't need me, helping her figure out, all the details of the situation that she's describing so that I can fix the problem, mostly as a way to regulate my own
Mm.
distress. And this is the other thing that we think when we think that most of the world is right or wrong. The challenge with this is that that's not actually what the brain is doing. The brain even sees and wants to know what is right and wrong primarily as a way to regulate its emotional state.
Yeah.
We like to say nobody ever makes a decision primarily or first because it makes sense. We make sense of things that feel
Yeah.
good. And so it is not to say that there are not things for which binary questions and answers, switches rather than rheostats, are the proper way to engage the world. That is absolutely the case. The real question is, am I flexibly able to pause and shift and move into a space in which the binary right wrong way of being in the world is now not what is being called for?
Mm.
We're not throwing it out. We have to have it in order to live, right? We have to have that. It's necessary, but it's necessary for the purpose ultimately of withness.
That's so good.
And so, to your friend Matt, if Matt were in the room, I want to say, like, dude, the first thing I want to say is I'm just so grateful that we have people like you who are working your tail off, doing the things that require somebody to know what right and wrong is.
Mm.
That's the first thing I would want him to know. That part of what he does that is in that realm is indispensable. And I would want him to know that he's doing that always for some. I mean, like, why does he even have a job in the Air
Right.
Force? Right? Because, like, we're protecting things. What are we protecting? Well, our country. Well, what is that? What is that? We're really talking about the relationships that are sitting around the kitchen table.
Mm.
We can talk about it in all kind of, philosophical and political language and so forth, our way of life, blah, blah, blah. And that's not unhelpful or unimportant, such as it is. But at the end of the day, that's not what my brain is primarily paying attention to.
That's good. It's so good. One of the things that I've heard you talk about as you on your podcast is this idea about creating a hospitality towards suffering. In the deepest places is kind of this journey of that at a much bigger scale. How would you explain what it means to have a hospitality towards suffering when it sounds so not fun?
Mm, mm. Well, first of all, to affirm that it's not
Yeah.
fun. It's not fun. It's like I had the opportunity to talk about to talk publicly about a friend of mine a couple of months ago at a gathering in which we were honoring her, and then there was a few of us that were asked to, provide a word that would represent this person. And I said, the word that I would choose for my friend is
Mm.
hospitable. She's hospitable. And I said, but you think about hospitable, and the first thing you think is like, oh, I like the idea of hospitality. The notion of like, oh, welcoming people into my home, gatherings. You're already thinking about this, but the reality is, Tony, for me, when I think about hospitality, I think of like inviting people that I want to have in my home.
Yeah.
I don't think of it. Nobody says to Curt, list the 10 people in your life that you would not want to be within a country mile of. And now let's imagine being hospitable.
Right.
Let's imagine being hospitable to those people. It's like what Jesus says, the people, everybody, it's not hard to love the people that you love, but it's your
Mm.
enemies, right? It's the tax collectors and the hookers and everybody that he's like, Matthew, let's have a party. Let's invite the people that nobody wants to invite. And I'm sure that even Matthew, he's like, oh my gosh, like, really? Like, And so the reason I was describing this about my friend is that this is a person who's worked really, really hard to be hospitable to the parts of herself that she doesn't like,
Mm.
the parts where she suffers, the parts where she can name things about her that she doesn't want to she doesn't want to be in a room with those parts. And most of us would look at our suffering and we would say, I want to first of all, I want to do everything I can to like to stop it, to get
Yeah.
rid of it. And if I can't do that, I got to find a way to just ignore it, to not have it, pay attention to it. And then if I can't do that, then I'm going to have to find a way to live with it, white knuckle it in some way, shape, or form. But the whole notion of honoring it, the whole notion of allowing and imagining Jesus to be in the room with that, in many respects, is just beyond our capacity to imagine. Like it's beyond my capacity to imagine by myself. I've lost three brothers to cancer, and the first one who passed it was 19 years ago this past December, and he lived with pancreatic cancer. My brother Jim, he lived with pancreatic cancer for 3 years before he died from it, and this is a man whose life was transformed into an icon of beauty and goodness over the course of his having cancer. He was a changed man in ways that were just remarkable. And I'll never forget, it was close to the end of his life, although we didn't know it at the time, but close to the end of his life, he said, this cancer is not something I would, and this is a guy like who suffered. He said, I wouldn't wish this on my worst enemy. And at the same time, I can say without any question that I'm not sorry that this has happened.
Wow.
And his life with his immediate family was changed. His life with his God was changed. His life with me, our relationship was completely changed. All for the better, everything. And it doesn't mean that it's magic, and but what we're saying, I think, is that the Christian story is one that looks at suffering and says we will do what we can, right? We're gonna treat cancer. We're going to fix the fractured femur. We're going to do the marriage work. We're going to do the repair work that we are able to do, in the healing work we are able to do. And we also recognize that that healing work in and of itself is, nobody gets out alive. It's not like,
Right.
oh, this is going to help us live forever. However, what it does do is that it's a reminder of what's coming. But when we get to points where we don't have any more tricks in our bag, this is when the family of faith, this is when the people of God create space for me to begin to reimagine what God is doing to use the suffering in my life. But I can't do that by myself. And so I don't make suffering hospitable. I don't do this by myself. I need the help of my community to help me become hospitable to this suffering, to reimagine what God is doing with it.
Yeah, to that point, I can imagine that there is a leader who's listening right now who wants very much to walk alongside the people that they're leading in their suffering. And yet, how do we do that? How do we help someone else be hospitable to their suffering when at the same time I'm grappling with my own?
It's a great question, and I think the my response, if you and I were now to be sitting in the room with any and all of the leaders who are listening, I think one of the questions that I would have would be, whose job is it to be present with your suffering?
Mm.
Because we can't give what we don't have. I, I can't, I won't be able to listen to a podcast and collect a set of tools whereby which I can then go and apply this to my friend who's suffering and say, now I can go do that. Um, I am going to be most effectively able to be with my friend who is suffering when I have been able to identify where are the places in my life that my suffering lies. Now, part of the challenge with this is that most of us who live in our particular time and space, if we're in the West and in our kind of affluency that we live with, we have so many accessories that distract me. I have so many that distract me from my suffering. You would say, "Well, Curt, how do you suffer?" I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, maybe when I have a death of a brother or a parent or something, those kinds of things. But I don't, Tony, I don't really have any place where I'm
Mm.
suffering right now, and that may be true, uh, except uh, when you read about those people, whether it's church fathers or others, who giants in the faith, what you eventually will run into is that these are people who have found the rooms in their own souls where the suffering lies because they are coming into contact with the parts of themselves that are not yet fully what they want them to
Mm.
be. And if the more serious we are about following Jesus, the more ruthless we will feel to want to change those parts of us that continue to rise up their heads and want to tempt us or draw us into places we don't want to go. Like we will become much more acutely aware of the parts of me that I actually just want to keep out of the room. And the reason I don't feel like I suffer is because I'm working really, really effectively at not paying attention to the parts of myself that I hate the most. And I got to tell, like, we all have them. We all have those parts. And so if I'm the leader to whom this question is directed or is about, I'm going to wonder, like, where are those parts of your story and who is helping to care for those? And when we have that experience where someone is coming for us in this way, we are then going to have a front row seat about what it's like, what I want to be then for the person that I want to care for, the person that I know that is suffering. I'm going to have a better sense viscerally of what that means for me to walk into the room with that person and just say, I would just want to be in the room with you, and to say, I'm sure that this is hard. I'm sure that this is hard in ways that I like don't know, but I'm not leaving the room.
Hmm.
I'm not leaving the room. And because the whole notion, that I tell people we live almost as if we think the Bible begins in the third chapter of Genesis. It's like we know about the first
Right.
two chapters, but we don't really have the sense that that's where it actually begins. And so it's challenging for us because we know that we're sinners and we need to be redeemed and so forth and so on, but we are so aware of that we forget that God has not forgotten his
Mm.
mission from the first two pages of the Bible. It has not changed. That it is still his mission for us, men and women, to rule as kings and queens on the earth, to create and curate beauty and goodness in the earth. This is the new heaven and earth that's coming. And this is what he's getting us ready to be able to do. Like, this is St. Paul. He said, do you, like, you who are going to, like, judge angels? Like, really? We just kind of like, oh, I don't know what that means. That certainly, that just must be like metaphor or ancient myth or whatever, but it's not really real. And so the whole point being, we forget often what those first 2 pages are trying to do. And in those first 2 pages, there is one haunting line for me. And the haunting line is, it's not good for the man to be alone.
Yeah.
And we each have parts of ourselves that are living alone. For many of our listeners will have a sense that, gosh, in general, I just feel I feel alone in my marriage. I feel alone at my work. I feel alone in my church. I've got pastors. I feel less. I'm leading like this congregation, and I feel alone. Yes, and I have an elder board who loves me and cares for me, all of which may be true. But I'm also aware that these are the people that I'm trying to serve. But I'm also the people that I'm like y'all could fire my butt. Like, we know this. This is like, and that current is never not running in the back roads of my mind. And so, for those leaders who want to care for and step into the suffering of others, we first must know that our suffering. And by know, I don't mean know that my suffering is cared for. Know, like I know that Columbus is the capital of Ohio, even though I'm not living there now. I have to feel in my chest the awareness of others who are with me in my suffering that enables me to then do the same for others by being present, by being curious, by being able to ask open-ended questions, by being able to articulate, being present with empathy, but also being able to ask, what more can I do for you? I simply want to be with you. All those things that don't present themselves in binary ways.
Beautifully stated. In that same conversation, as I was listening to the podcast, the Being Known podcast, if you don't subscribe, strongly recommend it. You talk about hope, and hope is a thing that is formed. Can you give us a deeper dive into that idea? It's an idea that I hadn't heard before, but as I heard it, it brought me much hope, ironically, and I just loved it. I loved it, and honestly, it made me love Jesus even more in the moment. But I'm wondering if you can dive into that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing I would say, Tony, is that hope is a thing that we actually appropriate. We live with hope all the time. We can't survive without hope. You're like, I don't know, what do you mean? Well, things as simple as, even though you're not thinking about this consciously, when you get in your car in the morning and put the key in or you hit the button, like, you hope the car starts. Right. Now, you're not thinking about this, and the reason you don't think about it is because you've had so much practice getting into your car and it's starting that you don't think about hope as hope necessarily. But it's what we're doing all the time. I walk across the floor and I hope that the floor holds. I'm anticipating it will hold. I hope. Now, it's not conscious to me because I'm so busy doing this. It's rare. I can't tell you the last time I walked across the floor and it didn't hold. Like, it always holds. It doesn't mean I'm not hoping that it does. Because, so those two things. One is I'm hoping all the time. And the second thing, like, what is hope? Hope is the anticipated future of a good outcome of whatever it is that I'm imagining. But we start, if that makes sense, right? So it's always around, like, my brain's anticipated future. Hope is a construct that when we talk about it, we're talking about the future, whether it's 5 seconds from now or 5 years from now. I hope that my son is able to get out of his addiction. I hope that my marriage can turn a corner. I hope that we can hire a new worship director. I hope. But we start, if that makes
Yeah.
sense, but we start talking about hope pretty much the minute that we're worried that we won't have
Mm.
it. Otherwise, we're just living hopefully. We're living hopefully all the time. But we talk about it, we name it, we worry about it, we long for it in those spaces where it's really hard to come by. When the evidence of my lived experience is I'm worried about my anticipated future. And what's crucial about this is and knowing like kind of what the mind does is that we live as if because we're not aware that we're actually forming hope all the time, right? We start to do this from the moment that we begin to have some degree of consciousness, right? Toddlers are hoping that their little legs will hold while they're
Right.
they're
Yeah.
doing this. But the beauty about this is that hope often, when we talk about it, it often can feel kind of capricious. It often feels rather like, well, I don't know, maybe I'll have hope, or maybe I won't. I hope it like it's gonna have to like I hope that I'm able to hope. It's gonna like fall into my lap.
Mm.
It's like I don't have any agency in becoming hopeful. When in fact, uh, the hope that I have for anything in the future, my anticipated outcome of goodness and beauty, is based on what I am doing right now and calling to
Yeah.
memory. Human beings are, as we like to say, we remember our future. The future that I anticipate, good, bad, or otherwise, is going to be an outgrowth and extension of the part of my brain that is able to anticipate the future in a way that we believe squirrels and elk don't. But it's going to be doing that based on the memory that I have encoded. This is why it is that I can hope that Ohio State wins the Big Ten. Oh, because like we have evidence of this, that they can win a
Right.
game, maybe two or more, right? But like it's based on certain things that have happened in the past. And so I hope to have a good marriage because I've been dating this person for, 18 months and there are a lot of things about it that are embedding good things in my memory. And that's what I use to anticipate my future. The real difficulty is when something traumatic happens, something difficult happens right now that is big enough that it's making it really difficult for me to
Mm.
access memory of goodness and beauty. When there's enough violence, when cancer just walks into your living room, and you've had good health all your life, and you think, oh, I had good health, so I anticipate having good health and so forth. And then cancer shows up, and you're like, I don't have an argument for this, and it doesn't matter how much memory of good health I have. Right now, I like an 18-wheeler has just like run me over in the
Yeah.
crosswalk. And so in that notion, I'm going to need the assistance of other brains in the room. I'm going to need the assistance of other minds. I'm going to need the assistance of the community of faith that I can borrow to pay attention to what is it that I'm now remembering, even in the face of what feels like a catastrophic trauma. Our pastor and his wife and family lost their son to suicide coming up on about 10 months ago.
Wow.
And you don't there's no response to this. There's no solving that problem. There's only being with. And the whole notion of hope for them is one in which hope will only be formed over a long period of time, in which we who are with them will be with them as often as we are possibly able to be with them, and in the moment in which their grief remains, we are going to continue to say, this is really hard, and we're not leaving the room.
Mm.
If it takes Jesus 10,000 more years to return, we're not leaving the room. And in that, I'm not trying to give them hope that wipes away everything. I'm trying to give them hope that gets them to the next day.
Yeah.
Or to the next week, while they are trying to recover from this horror. And it is in that space where our suffering can be so egregious that it's difficult for me, the one who suffers, to even get my mind, it's hard for me to access anything other than the pain that I'm experiencing. And it's in that space where I need people to say, we're here.
Yeah.
And we see that you're even having a hard time paying attention to us, and that's okay. We're here, and we're not leaving. And we're going to be with you. I mean, this is Jesus quoting the entirety of Psalm 22 on Good Friday, right? Matthew's gospel, reports him quoting the first verse of it. But it would be, completely reasonable for us to recognize that Matthew's gospel is written to Jewish people, and there's the whole notion of the particular way that rabbis would write things and speak about things. That Matthew is not just appealing to just the first line of that psalm. He's appealing to the entire psalm. And the entire psalm is one, at the end of the day, is one of vindication and comfort. And that's what we as the body of Jesus are called to be. Because we can gather around and we can know, as was the case for my brother, as is the case for our pastor and his wife and daughter, that we're not going to roll the clock back and undo history. But we are not going to allow evil to dictate what the future will be.
Amen.
And this is where we would say that Jesus shows up for us in such a way that he's not expecting us to white knuckle things. He's actually going to use the very thing. This is Joseph's words to his brothers in Egypt when all was revealed. He said, what you meant for evil, God has meant for good. We like to remember, it's important to remember, when Jesus said, it's finished, evil also thought it was finished. It's just that they meant two very different things. Because evil didn't see Easter coming. It was outside the purview of its imagination. And in the same way, evil will then continue to throw bad things, whatever they are, will throw our traumas, will throw our shame, will throw our histories, will throw all the things. Are being betrayed by friends, are like all the things will throw at us, hoping, as it were, expecting that our suffering will cause us to disintegrate. And what the gospel says is that even in that space, God is going to use the very thing that evil means for evil. And even God, just like, the serpent was generally considered to be not your friend. Right? But why is it that when Moses throws his staff down on the ground at the burning bush, it turns into a snake? Why is it that it's a snake that is put on a post for the Hebrews to look at and be healed from the snakes that were biting them? Because God is going to take even evil itself and use it for healing. And because this is the kind of God we serve, and so this is we are called to be people who will be those who will sit with others, such that they can continue to form hope in ways that we can't yet imagine. We can't imagine it yet because, like when the awful thing hits, we like to say the trauma tends to shatter not just my life, but it shatters the lens through which I now understand my life. And so I actually need somebody else's capacity to view my life. And I'm going to hang on to that. And I'm going to practice hoping, or I'm going to practice letting them hope for me while my imagination is trying to catch up slowly. And this is what Jesus was doing when he comes to earth in the first place, right? He shows up and like, he's saying things, the Sermon on the Mount, he's, it's just like, we don't, what is he talking about? Eat my flesh, drink my blood. What do you mean? This is weird. He's trying to whet the appetites of our imaginations. But it's hard for us to do this. And so he's helping us practice imagining in the way that he is, while ours are slowly trying to catch up to his. And that, I think, in a lot of respects, is no small part of what we're doing in forming hope in the presence of our suffering. And because we know that what's behind this is this notion of glory and secure attachment, and this longing that God is just as deeply longing to be with us in the middle of our pain as he is at any other time.
I so appreciate the depth of that thought process, especially as it pertains to what God does in the midst of all of that. I know we're running up against time, and I want to be respectful of your time. So I have one more question for you, but before I ask it, where can everybody stay in tune to the ministry that you're doing? How can they follow you? Where do they go to make sure that they know about the next book and so on and so forth?
Well, thanks, Tony. You're very kind to ask. I think one thing I would point people toward would be the Being Known podcast. That's probably currently the place where people are most likely to get access to the work that I do. You can also find me at curtthompsonmd.com, my personal website. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. Those, I guess it's not Twitter anymore, but whatever that X. You can follow that, and then there's also, I think, I'm inviting people to look at. There's a place called the Center for Being Known, which is our nonprofit wing that is developing lay-led confessional communities. Along with, we have a conference. We've had 3 conferences now. We've got another one coming up in October, the last full weekend in October, where we've got just a really great slate of speakers and workshops around this question of the intersection of neuroscience and Christian spiritual formation. We've got musical artists and others that are coming to be part of that. So we're really, really thrilled about that. That'll be here in Northern Virginia, in person and online. And so those are some ways to find out about me.
Love it. And let me just give a plug for the podcast, because you're going chapter by chapter through the book, and you and your co-host do a great job of bouncing off each other. And really, if you're not a reader, this is a great way to access the book material in a really kind of very practical and easy on-ramp to the stuff. So subscribe to that wherever you listen to podcasts. Okay, the last question that I wanted to ask you was specifically about you and the process of writing the book. And so I'm curious, what did you learn about your relationship with God and suffering as you wrote these words?
I think I would say as I'm thinking about this, 2 things. I would say I do think I became more aware of the part of me that wants to avoid suffering. And I don't just mean that kind of like generically, like, oh, I want to avoid suffering in general. I mean, particular parts of me where if I Um, if I enter into that particular room in my house, it's very unpleasant
Yeah.
for me. So I think that would be one thing that this felt sense of God, like, well, you want to write this book? Let's take it seriously. Let's start to do some inventory here of that. And then I think, in addition, I think it further persuaded me. And I'm imperfect at this, but further persuaded me of the necessary place of
Mm.
community in being like for me to. I don't want to just go into those rooms by
Yeah.
myself. I actually can do that more effectively to the degree that I am bringing my suffering to this group of men that I meet with on Tuesdays and to our uh, this what we call a covenant group or a small group from church. To the people who know me as well as anybody on the planet knows me, and so I think those are the things. And so my invitation, especially to our listeners, would be: I want us to be unafraid of anything that suffering conjures for us. I want us to be unafraid of being afraid of it, like because we're all afraid. Like we're all afraid of it, like by its very nature. And but Jesus very much is unafraid of it, intends to meet us there, and intends to use it to even more effectively um, form us into the durable people he wants us to be if we're going to live in his heaven when it gets here.
Beautiful. And Curt, thank you so much for being so generous with your time today and the willingness to sit in this digital room with us. And it's just an absolute pleasure to kind of glean from your wisdom. So thank you.
Mm. You're very welcome, Tony. Again, just a real pleasure. Great to be with you today.